Good evening. We are going to discuss the rest of the themes of the interpreter of Maladies by Jhumpa Lahiri. So last week we looked at two themes. They are lack of communication between characters and the consequences. And next we looked at culture clash or culture differences. And today we are going to discuss the third theme of the story, the danger of romanticism. So, in this story, we meet several characters, and then when we look at these characters, we can focus our attention with regard to this theme on Mr. Kapasi and also to a certain extent Mr. Das and then Mrs. Das as well. And when we consider Mr. Kapasi, it's clear that he has romanticized Mrs. Das and he started to build his dreams upon her when she told him that his job was romantic. And also, he noticed that uh, he was not interested, she was not interested in her surrounding and in her husband. And then even she was not that interested in that tour as well. And then she did not show affection towards her children too. And having noticed all these things, perhaps he was surprised to learn that suddenly she was roused from her dream like state and then said that his job was romantic. So he misinterpreted the interest in him. And we know in the story, he became suddenly conscious of his appearance and he felt like a teenage boy in love, checking his reflection, being conscious of his suit and about perspiration that may have collected beneath the synthetic material of his suit. So in that way, from the change of his behavior, as readers we know that he has started to build his dreams upon Mrs. Das. To quote some examples, she had also used the word romantic. She did not behave in a romantic way towards her husband, and yet she had used the word to describe him. And we know those are the thoughts of Mr. Kapasi. And the story is unraveled through his focus. Also, her sudden interest in him. An interest she did not express in either her husband or her children was mildly intoxicating. When Mr. Kapasi thought once again about how she had said romantic, the feeling of intoxication grew. So we notice how he started to be more and more infatuated with Mrs. Das. And later, sometime later, we find, while they were in the premises of the Sun Temple, Mr. Kapasi experienced an overwhelming urge to wrap his arms around her, to freeze with her, even for an instant. And also, he started to admire the backs of her bare legs, and that made him recall how he never admired the bare legs of his wife. So that signals his dissatisfaction with his relationship, with intimate relationship with his wife. And also we know that when Mrs. Das asked him, for God's sake, stop calling me Mrs. Das. I'm 20. You probably have children my age. That is after revealing her dirty little secret. And then she requested him to interpret it. And then perhaps she was hoping that perhaps he would be able to suggest a certain remedy. So it disturbed him to learn that she thinks of him as a parent. And of course, that is where he was gradually brought back to the real world. So the feeling he had towards her that made him check his reflection in the rear view mirror as they drove evaporated a little. Right? That is coming back to reality. Right? That is the end of his signals, the end of his infatuation with Mrs. Das, because he realized that she was not interested in him in that way. So he was waking up from his dream. And later we find Mr. Kapasi felt insulted that Mrs. Das should ask him to interpret her common, trivial little secret. So he was offended that she wanted him to interpret that trivial little secret, and she did not want something lofty from him. That is against, once again, against his expectations. And also, she only asked for his address, right? Just because she would be able to send him some photos they have taken together. But the moment she asked for his address, he started to imagine that that will be the beginning of a deeper relationship, romantic relationship. And then he dreamed of that relationship developing uh, through time and through their correspondence, and then how he would narrate certain stories about his patients, and then how she would speak about a dissatisfaction with the marriage, and then in turn he's revealing his, and then later he realized that these fantasies are a projection of his desires, and they are actually not a real reflection of Mrs. Das's actions and words. So finally, he was awakened from his romantic fantasy. So towards the end of the story, we found he knew at that moment he was not even important enough to be properly insulted. So when he asked, was it pain or guilty experience? And then she was trying to say something. She was angry and she was trying to say something. And then she thought a little bit and closed her mouth. And at that moment, he realized that he was not even important enough to be properly insulted. That is, he was a nobody to Mrs. Das. Mrs. Das doesn't consider him as somebody special. And also at the end of the story, we find how that slip of paper with the Mr. Kapasi's address on it fluttered away in the wind. And then he understood at that time that that is the end of his infatuation, short lived infatuation. So that is the scene he will remember about Das family. Right? That's how the story ended. Okay, so the story illustrates the danger of romanticism. And also this discusses migration, exile and return. And Das family are Americanized Indians. They are Indian Americans. And of course we learned that they are immigrants, but second generation immigrants. They are not first generation immigrants. Because we learned that both of them were born and raised in America. So India is far away from them. So they are alienated from their country of origin. Country of origin is India. So in India, they are like tourists. They are aliens in terms of landscape, people and culture. So repeatedly, it is shown in the short story that they cannot, they cannot interpret Indian landscape accurately. They don't understand it. So that's why they had certain problems in the interaction with the environment of that country. As an example, monkeys. So actually they cannot understand their behavior. But Mr. Kapasi knows how the monkeys behave, and you should not feed them, right? If you don't provoke them, then you don't have to be scared of them. But we know in the story how Mrs. Das, of course, she was not conscious of what she was doing. So she was spilling some puffed rice, and that provoked the monkeys, that tempted the monkeys, and they provided a threat to the safety of her child. And they cannot understand people also. And when they converse with people of India, like Mr. Kapasi also, so we find in certain places how Mr. Kapasi is unable to interpret their expressions. As an example, when Mrs. Das said neat, he was unsure what that exactly meant. But then, that was actually a part of her everyday language. So without thinking, she uses, because we know that they are westernized and they have absorbed American culture, American ways, and their language, and also culture, right? So in terms of culture as well, so they are aliens to their native Indian culture. So I think you all can remember when Mr. Kapasi greeted Mr. Das in the Indian way. He returned that greeting with a handshake. So he was not that familiar with the Indian culture, even though that is his culture too. Okay, and then migration, exile, that is, of course, you are in a different country and then you return. After some time, you return to that country, and in your country of origin, you find yourself a stranger. And Das couple tries to understand India, especially Mr. Das. He tries to understand India through a guidebook, and that guidebook too is published abroad. So he tries to look at his country of origin through the focus of a foreigner, right? So when they return, they do not return as natives of that country, but as strangers. So let's move on to the next theme, identity. And identity too is quite important to the story. So we find Das family with bicultural identity, right? So American identity and then Indian identity. They were born and raised in America, but they are Indian by origin. And we know Mr. and Mrs. Das, they have Indian names, Raj and Meena. But when it comes to their children, we know that they have American names, Ronnie, Bobby, Tina, right? So bicultural identity. So they have absorbed some of their uh, original culture. But anyway, we know that they are mainly influenced by their host culture. So diasporic community experiences a loss of identity, right? So they don't know actually to what country they should actually or really belong to. So in that way, they experience a sort of confusion with regard to their real identity, right? And we know that they are Indians, but not of India. Shall we then move on? And to focus on yet another theme that is relevant to the story, it's Mrs. Das's guilt. Mrs. Das's guilt is eating away at her. And we know how mentally agonized she is. Because we know that she repeatedly uses a certain term when speaking about psychological condition, how she felt. And she used the word terrible, terrible many times, like feeling terrible. And then how sometimes she felt like throwing uh, her possessions out of window. So her guilt is eating away at her, and the revelation of which, that is, of the guilt, would threaten to tear her family apart. Of course, she wanted to release her emotions and then to be free, to have a relief, mental relief. But it is clear that that would threaten her family unity. She is offended when Mr. Kapasi asks whether it is pain or guilt she experiences. Maybe because it's a guilt actually she experiences, right? But however, she was offended, she was angry when he mentioned guilt. And then bad parenting too is another theme that is prominent throughout the story. So from the beginning of the story, we have seen how the parents quarreled in front of their children, and also how Mr. Kapasi, as a middle-aged person, noticed that they were too young. Das couple is too young to be the parents of their children. So they appeared like siblings of their own children. So their immaturity. So they are too young, not yet 30, but having three children already. And then, so we find in more than in one place how they neglected their duties, parental duties, and arguing over their duties and dividing their duties between them. And also, both of them are self absorbed. And we know Mrs. Das is self absorbed, that is clearly manifested in the story. But then, when it comes to her husband, Raj, he too is self absorbed. And we know for the most part of the trip, he is occupied with his camera, either occupied with his camera or his travel book. And he rarely paid attention to his children or to his wife. So that indicates distancing. There's a distance between husband and wife, and then they have distanced themselves from their children too. And negligence, that is a neglect. How they have neglected their children and their needs and their desires are disregarded. And also, both of them fail to give protection to their children. And we know that is one of the main duties of parents, protecting their children, because children cannot take care of themselves. They needed looking after by an adult. And we know that they are in an alien country, even though that is their country of origin, they are like tourists. So their parents should uh, keep an eye over them, but they fail to do so because both of them are not that interested in children. And Mrs. Das considers them as a burden because we know that she is harassed by parental duties, having to work a lot at home. And in Mrs. Das, we find a frustrated, harassed, overworked, exhausted housewife. So there is insensitivity to the needs of children and to their desires. As an example, we can quote how Tina wanted her nails polished, and her mother continued to polish her nails and disregarded her repeated requests. Right? That could have been her desire as a girl. So she was not sensitive to her desires, and she was harassed rather than enjoying taking care of them. And we know that she doesn't feel very maternal towards her children. So there, she is different from a typical Indian mother, and she's not a sacrificial mother. And we know most Eastern mothers, especially Indian mothers, love their children very much, and that love is a selfless love, and that cannot be seen in Meena. And I think this is relevant to her. Just because I'm a mom doesn't mean I care, right? She's a mom, but that doesn't mean that she cares for her children. Let's move on. So now let's pay our attention to techniques. And first of all, let's look at point of view. And we know point of view of any story is very important, and it helps us to have a better understanding of the story. And in interpreter of Maladies, we find third person limited point of view. So this point of view is Mr. Capacis. And only Mr. Capacis' thoughts and ideas are presented. And here and there we find like indication to Meena's feelings. But anyway, these instances do not provide enough insight into how her mind works. But of course, we learn about Mr. Capaci's ideas, his thoughts, his wishes, his frustrations, his disappointments. We see through the focal point of Mr. Capaci. But Mr. Capaci is a person who has a limited understanding of American culture. And we know that this couple is actually they are Indian Americans, and so they behave like Americans than Indians. But Mr. Kapasi, even though he knows the language, he can use the language, their language English, and he thinks that he knows their culture, but his understanding of their culture is limited. And we know that is limited to his watching some movies and then operas, right? Uh, and through that, he understood something about American culture. And that is not a satisfactory understanding of that culture and people. So only the events that are accessible to Mr. Kapasi are mentioned. Right, there are some events Mr. Kapasi doesn't know, and then they are not mentioned or they are not analyzed in the story. he not only observes but interprets as well. So that too is something we can see in the story. He not only sees but interprets. One example is Mr. Kapasi observes that uh, Das couple is very young, and he interpreted that as they are being too young to take the responsibility of their children. So his observations are there, that is what he sees, and also his the way he interprets, the way he understands what he has seen. Then let's look at the next technique, irony. So one good example of the use of irony in the story is what is noticed by Mr. Kapasi is not noticed by Mr. Das. And Mr. Kapasi is an outsider. And he does not have a long-standing relationship with them. And, he's their driver, the tour guide. And within that short period of time, he noticed that Bobby looked different from other children. He looked pale in appearance and also in his behavior too. He is unlike the other two. But it is not noticed by Mr. Das. And we know Mr. Das is not his biological father. That is a secret. And Mrs. Das said that she had to keep that secret for 8 long years, and she was burdened by that secret. So what is obvious to an outsider is not obvious to the parent. And then to move on to flashback. So there are several examples in the story, and about Mrs. Das's marriage and also Mr. Kapasi's marriage, right? And uh, as readers, we learn about their marriages, their married lives through flashbacks. And also Mr. Kapasi's ambitions when he was a student, and then how his parents arranged that marriage, and also death of his child, and how he had to do 2 jobs to uh, give the family what they wanted, right? These things are presented through flashbacks. And then flash forward. So flash forward, we find how Mr. Kapasi dreamt about their correspondence between himself and Mrs. Das, and how it would grow, the things they would exchange, their ideas, their experiences, their dissatisfactions, and all these things are presented in the form of flash forwards in the story. And to look at yet another technique, motif. The motif is an idea, or it may be a symbol, it may be an idea, it may be a theme, and it comes up over and over again in a story. And in this story, we know that seeing, the seeing is mentioned in different ways in many places in the story. And of course, I think you can remember how I asked you to notice the verbs that can be related to seeing. So we found many verbs like that, like observed, noticed, watched, saw, right? So seeing, and also we know that Mr. Kapasi is a person who sees uh, everything. That is, who observes, who notices Das family, right? So therefore, we find how he saw the things, like looking at Mrs. Das through prayer view mirror, and then what he understood about Mrs. Das, and what he understood about the family. And also in the story, we have seen how various characters weaved others through artificial means. And when we look at Raj, he was looking at the landscape and people of India through camera lens. And we know that does not provide a satisfactory idea or picture about India or people or the landscape, because what he can see through camera lens is limited, and he focuses his attention on what he wants to see and he neglects the rest. So that is not natural, looking at something through a camera. So it is different from the way you look at something through your own eyes. And also visors. So it was noticed in the story that children were wearing visors. Once again, a kind of an obstruction to their vision. And then sunglasses, Mrs. Das's sunglasses, and she was looking at the others and everything wearing sunglasses. And also we find car window, and like that in the story we find uh, how the reality is a kind of hidden from the characters. So when you look at something wearing sunglasses, perhaps you are not able to decide on the real color or the real shade, and your vision may be somewhat like distorted, right? Different from the vision you have when you look at something through your naked eyes. And Mr. Das takes a photo of a poor peasant, but he fails to understand his real plight. He was interested in the photo only, but then he failed to see and understand a lot of things there. and he failed to understand that they were very poor, that the peasant was very poor, and the bullocks were emaciated also. Peasant was emaciated, they are very poor, they were hungry and starving, and it was a very sad story behind that picture. And then he was not sensitive to the plight of that person, and we know that he never wanted to give something to that person, right? He only took a photo and then he was satisfied. Okay, right. So seeing is something quite important in the story. Then let's move on. Another technique widely used in the story is symbolism. So as you can see from the pictures, puffed rice, monkeys, the sun temple, camera, and here we find sunglasses. So Indian food. So symbol of Indian food. So Indian food mentioned here is actually puffed rice. And puffed rice, we know that that is not a actually that's not a filling diet. So that is like a snack. And also we know that Mrs. Das did not want to share that with anyone. And it is also an indication to Mrs. Das's selfishness. She ate alone. She did not want to share puffed rice with her children. Didn't offer that to anyone. And also we know that that is something that attracted hostile elements, monkeys. And also uh, that indicates a careless behavior. And then even though she's an Indian, we know that she cannot understand India. And she's like a foreigner, born and raised in America. So she was walking like a very careless tourist, like throwing things about, scattering. And we know when she put that packet of paper packet of rice into her bag, she put that without uh, folding the top, so scattering them. And then when she was walking towards that monastery, she was spilling puffed rice behind her. And then let's move on to the next symbol, monkeys. So they are the harbingers of chaos. Chaos, that is disturbance. Harbingers are the messengers. And we know monkeys by nature are very restless creatures. So sometimes they can be violent too. And they are like indisciplined, and then like moving here and there. And Mr. Kapasi warned them not to tempt them with food. So one should not provoke them. So you should deal with these elements very carefully. And we know monkeys belong to India, right? So when you deal with them, you have to deal with them very carefully. And Mr. Kapasi can understand their behavior, and he understood that they are an obvious threat, whereas others cannot understand it. So they were inviting troubles, right? So they are wild and violent, and we know they became violent later. That monkey started to attack Bobby, and we know Bobby was the person who took the stick first, and the monkey grabbed it, and it became fearless and started to hit him with that. So they can be violent, right? So you have to uh, like you have to respect them in a certain way, that you should not provoke them, that you should not disturb them. And of course during their journey we found how they jumped onto the vehicle and then onto the road, and they made Mr. Kapasi to apply brakes, and the children screamed, and Mr. Das explained that they had not seen monkeys outside a zoo. So they obviously they can't understand monkeys, even though they are part of that environment. And next, the Sun Temple, as you can see in the picture, and we know the Sun Temple is a symbol of their ancient culture, and that is of importance, historical and cultural importance, and they can't understand it. So Mr. Kapasi had to explain the importance. And Mr. Das read something about it in the guidebook, and then uh, he was aware of certain facts about the Sun Temple. But Mrs. Das, we know that she was not interested in that, and she was only interested in the images, right? And she was going round, and then she actually enjoyed it, right? Even though she was actually not a fan of Indian culture, those images interested her. And then camera, of course, we talked about it. That is, seeing a camera, seeing a world through a camera. And we know Mr. Das always carried a camera like a typical tourist. And then he always looked at the environment through that camera lens. So we wonder whether he actually wanted to understand something about real India, because he was taking photos one after the other. So his knowledge is kind of limited. The knowledge he gets after traveling is obviously limited, and also he's not in direct touch with reality, because you don't see the real picture when you look at something through a lens. And then sunglasses and visor, once again we find a kind of an obstruction of vision, that you don't get a complete understanding or correct idea of something. And then clothes, right? Even though they are Indians, they look like Indians, but they are wearing Western clothes. And adults and children both. And children were wearing, yes, t-shirts, and then they had visors and all that. And when it comes to parents also, we can see Mrs. Das too is not dressed like a typical Indian person. Even though she was touring in India, she was dressed like a foreigner. They're wearing something very short and exposing her legs. And that may be why that man at the stalls, Puff Rice stall, started to sing, looking at Mrs. Das, but she could not understand that language. And about colors, we can see pink is a prominent color uh, in relation to Mrs. Das. And pink is everywhere in her dress, pink strawberry, and then even her sunglasses has a pinkish tint in them, and her nail polish. So pink seems to be her theme color, and pink lipstick as well. Right, so that is quite romantic and very feminine color. So that is in a way that reflects a mentality, like girlish mentality, romantic mentality, wearing pink and carrying pink things. Right. So I think that will do, because we have spent quite a lot of time on interpreter of melodies. So now it is a time to look at a question. So we discussed Cat in the Rain earlier, and the question is compare and contrast interpreter of melodies with Cat in the Rain. So when you respond to a question like that, it's worthwhile to have a chart or the main points written down somewhere before you start to write your answer. So before writing your answer in the proper way, so you can have a chart like this: interpreter of melodies and Cat in the Rain. And then first you notice the similar points between these two stories. So one or two similar points such as, yes, in interpreter of melodies and Cat in the Rain. So we find in both the stories, we find American families, but then with a certain difference. So that too is something you have to mention in your answer, because within a larger similarity, there may be minor differences. Right, in interpreter of melodies, we find a family with children. They are Indian Americans. Cat in the Rain, we find only husband and wife. They don't have children. And we find in the wife yearning to have children, but even though she does not say so using exact words, direct words. And also we find they are not in, even though they are Americans, they are not in America. They have traveled somewhere else. In Cat in the Rain, they are in Italy and they are spending a vacation. And in Interpreter of Melodies, also we find the family on a vacation and they have gone to India. And in Cat in the Rain, they have gone to Europe. And also, when we think about their economic status, and in both cases, we find these Americans are able to afford a tour outside their country. So, to spend their vacation, so they can go abroad. And we know that Mr. Das is actually he is a school teacher. But in the story, in Interpreter of Melodies, we know that Mr. Kapasi, when he worked as a school teacher, he was unable to provide for his family. That's why he had to take up two jobs, right? So he had to do two jobs to support his family. And in the case of Mr. Das, we know that he too is a teacher and he is a only working person in the family, yet he is able to take his family on a tour to India. Right. So in Cat in the Rain also we find how the couple, they appear to be rich Americans touring Europe. And then also notice the differences as well. Yeah. So when you look at similarities and differences, you can think about themes also, issues as well. And to think about themes, in both stories we can see a lack of communication as one of the main issues in Interpreter of Melodies and also Cat in the Rain. And in Interpreter of Melodies we find how the how Raj and Meena, how they don't communicate properly as husband and wife to bring about understanding and sensitivity towards each other. And the same thing happens in Cat in the Rain. And we find the arguments between husband and wife in both cases. And the partners are not being very sensitive towards each other. So one can say that there is male domination in both stories. In Cat in the Rain, we know that George, how superior minded he is, how he wanted to control his wife, even though he outwardly appears to be polite, but he's not that. In Interpreter of Melodies too, we find uh, how Raj did not care that much for his wife. And when he invited his friend to stay in his home, he didn't even inform his wife. He didn't consult her. He didn't ask her opinion. Right? So he exercised his authority even though we don't find Raj as like a very strict or very rough character, but then he is rude to a certain extent. In Cat in the Rain, we find the male is quite rude, and in both the stories, we find how the females have to depend on the male because both of them don't appear to be working. And of course, we know that Meena is not working, and the wife in Cat in the Rain also uh, does not seem to be having financial independence. And then both wives show a kind of interest in another person, and that another person seems to be not of their own age, but adult figures. In Cat in the Rain also Pedron, right? He seems to be an older person, and then Mr. Capacito is a middle-aged person, and both wives are interested in these adult figures or like father figures. Maybe because both of them experience a certain need, psychological need, like somebody to guide them, to advise them, to tell them what they should do, right? So that may be a manifestation of their uh, psychological deficiency or dissatisfaction. Okay, right. So in that way, I want you to go through both stories and then find the similar points and differences, and then start to write. Okay, right. So I think that will do for the moment. Once again, there will be a power cut in a short while. So in this way, let's wind up the short story interpreter of melodies, and then next week we will be discussing something else. Okay, good night.